I'll just say a word or two about BFI and then a word about Marianne. So BFI really has two goals, which are pretty simple, which I think come right out of the legacy and the history of Gary Becker and Milton Friedman and Chicago economics, which are number one, help foster the creation of ideas that help people understand the world in a new and better and different way, usually with markets to help guide it. Seems to be a hallmark of Chicago. And then the second is to make sure that those ideas, as much as Marianne and I love to make sure our ideas appear in journals that maybe not everyone reads every day, make sure that those ideas make it into the broader world. And we try to do that in a variety of ways, and Marianne will be doing that today in talking to all of you. So, and her talk is titled The Glass Ceiling, and for those of you who've been following Marianne's work, it's going to be an exciting talk. So let me just say a couple words about her. She, I think, is the kind of scholar and economist that really anyone should want to be. The way I like to think about it is that she writes papers that I want to read. That's the most, don't tell all of my colleagues this, but I don't want to read all their papers. But she writes papers that I want to read faster than I can read them. Which is either a statement about how much good research she produces or how quickly I can read. She's just a terrific example of Chicago economics. So I enjoyed going to her website today and seeing that she says she does work in labor economics, corporate finance, and development economics, and then I could have added a couple other subfields. And so she really embodies the tradition of Chicago economics, which is that you don't have adjectives in front of it. You're just an economist and take on the world's problems wherever your interests go. I could probably but take the whole hour announcing the many accomplishments and awards that she's had. I'll just mention she's the co-director of the Booth Social Enterprise Initiative. So I think you guys are all undergrads, right? So we can talk freely with each other. The idea that there would be something broader than profit maximization inside a business school is a radical idea. And so she seems to be pursuing that. And she's also director of the Poverty Lab and on the board of several organizations. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I think probably happily no longer an editor of the AER, although she did a tremendous job there for 6 years, and a fellow of the Econometric Society. So please join me in welcoming Marianne Bertrand, and we all look forward to hearing it.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's amazing what a free lunch can do in terms of bringing people around. So I want to talk about the glass ceiling. So let me just put this talk in the background it deserves. I think there's no doubt, if you look around the world, that women have made substantial progress over roughly the last half century. It's particularly true in terms of education. I'm going to show you some pictures. It's been true in terms of women entry into the labor force at growing rates. And it's been true in terms of shrinking the gender gap in labor market earnings. I think the most striking progress is really when it comes to the education picture. This is the US, and most of what I'm going to show you today, with a few exceptions, is going to be focused on the US. This is, you guys, over time, this is a share of women and men that have at least completed a college degree by birth cohort. And it is now a very well-known phenomenon that, well, if you go back to the cohorts born in the 1950s, there were more men than women completing college. That has reversed dramatically. And in fact, this is a picture that was produced a decade ago by Larry Katz and Claudia Goldin. I've extended this picture for the additional 10 to 15 years that I've accumulated since. And this is just striking that this graph keep on growing. Essentially, the men have reached a plateau. In fact, it looks like it's trending down a little bit, and women are getting more and more educated. So there's a large literature, which I'm not going to spend time reviewing here, that has discussed why this progress has been happening, both on the education front and on the labor market front. This literature has stressed a lot of technological forces, the great improvements that have been due to women being better able to time their fertility thanks to the contraception. Literature has talked also about the role that improvement technology inside the home, think about the washing machine, the dishwasher, and how transformational that has been. This literature has also talked about how better controls on discrimination have also made a difference. And then finally, we know that on the labor market front, there's been changes in the kind of jobs in the economy and changes that have been advantageous to women, is that there are some skills, like social skills, that women in particular have more than men, and that's been, be good for women. Now, in light of this background, it remains true that women are still very much underrepresented in the higher status, higher earnings occupations in the economy. And furthermore, when they are represented in these higher status, higher earnings occupations, they tend to work systematically less than men within those occupations. So I can give you a few examples. This is probably the first one that will come to mind. From business school, we think about the C-suites. This is the share of Fortune 500 companies that have a female CEOs. So you can look at this and say this has been infinite progress. It has indeed been infinite progress. 4.8 divided by 0 is infinity. But it is still the case that we are at less than 5% of large firms in this country being headed by women. This is an example that's kind of closer to me, and an example that I've been doing a lot of thinking about for the last 6 months via various committee engagement. This is what's going on in economics. This is my profession. And we can see there is that while we have about a third of female PhD students in the PhD programs, the share of female professors that are women remains capped at about 13%. So we really have also within my profession a glass ceiling problem. This is kind of a more kind of comprehensive look at what the economy looks like over a 4-decade period. This is data from the census. The sample that I'm going to be interested in this paper, being focused on the glass ceiling, is going to be college-educated individuals. So this is looking at 25 to 24-year-old women with at least a college degree. The first line kind of confirms what I told you before, which is we've seen, see this work? Does this work? No light. So first line, you can see that the share of these women that are in the labor force has been, growing over time. But as has been already pointed out by, many papers and in the literature, we've essentially reached a plateau. So there's been a lot of progress up essentially the mid-1990s, and for the last 20 years, not much that has been going on. So this plateauing. The second part of the picture gives you a sense of where women fall in the distributions of earnings. So think about the kind of college-educated individuals that work full-time, full year in the economy. Use the distribution of men's earnings and pick the 50th percentile of this distribution, or the 80th percentile of this distribution, or 90th percentile of this distribution. And then look at what is the share of women working full-time, full year, whose earnings will be above the 50th percentile of the men's distribution, above the 80th or 90th percentile. If we had equal representation, you would want this number to be 50%, 20%, 10%, right? And what you see is that you're falling way below that on all of those metrics, and the glass ceiling would be essentially saying that the higher you make the thresholds in the men's distribution, the scarcer will be the representation of women over this threshold. And then if you look at this, it also feels like we've reached a bit of a plateau. You see improvement essentially up to 2000s, but not much improvement over the last 10 years. I can also show you the very, very top of the labor market. And this is based on work that Piketty and others have been doing using IRS data, which has a key advantage compared to the administrative data set that we typically use, that it's not top-coded. So you can easily look at really what's going on at the very, very top of the earnings distribution. What you see here is the representation of women in the top 10%. It's kind of what I showed you before, but then you can go up to the top 1% and the top 0.1%. And again, you see the same story of increased underrepresentation that grows on the position that grows as you go further and further up in the income distribution. And again, the same sense that there hasn't been much progress essentially since 2000. So those are, this is the background that, motivates a lot of what's going to be coming next. This is the other fact. It's a slightly different, it's not a slightly, it's actually a different fact. So even if you look at the women that work in the highest paying occupations in the economy, they earn less than men within those occupations. So what is this picture? I'm going to show you this picture again later on, so let me spend a minute on it. This is looking at the gender gap in earnings. So it's basically women's earnings minus men's earnings. And that's what's on the y-axis. And what is on the x-axis is the average men earnings. And every dot on this graph is a particular occupation. And this is focused on the 80-plus highest paying occupation in the economy. So there's a few things about this picture, is that in essentially all of these occupations, except that yellow triangle up there, women under-earn compared to men. So that's fact number one. But beyond that, I think if you were to try to run a regression line via this, you see that you would have a downward sloping line. So the meaning of this is that the difference between men and women's earnings in an occupation increases as the mean earning in that occupation go up. The higher paying the occupation is on average, the bigger the deficit women have compared to men in the occupation. All right, so why should we care about all this? Well, I can provide different views. One is probably what the activists out there would say, which is that this is not fair, this is not right. There should be equal pay for equal work. And I'm okay with, obviously, that. I agree there should be equal pay for equal work. The main kind of caveat I want to put to this is that a lot of what's going to be coming in the next few slides is going to be a perspective where the reason for these differences in earnings between men and women are really a reflection of not equal work between men and women. It will be a subtle version of that, but I want to just be very clear about this from the get-go. I think another reason why one should work about this is, as an economist that just cares about issues of efficiency, I would say that if you start from the premise, and I'm very, very happy to start with it, that talent is equally distributed between men and women, we should not have a picture like this one, right? If you start from the premise that at birth there are as many equally talented women than men, it seems that we are not running the best economy that we can, with having only 5% of firms being run by women rather than men. There's some work that my colleague Cheng Tai Che and Eric Hurst did not so long ago that did an exercise to try to quantify how much has been left on the table in the US over the last 50 years in terms of GDP growth by having restriction or barriers to entry into some occupations for women and also minorities. And the kind of exercise, calibration exercise that they do suggests that about a quarter of the GDP growth that we've experienced over the last 50 years has been coming from the fact that these barriers to entry to women and minorities into various professions has been going down. So that's really, I think, a very strong argument as to why you should care. And then finally, certainly you hear a lot in business this view that diversity is good. Diversity is good. It makes for better decisions. It makes for more kind of better performing company. And it's very, very clear to me that a lot of businesses are making the case for diversity and inclusion just based on it's going to be good for business. I think this is obviously an important point. What I should note here is that if I look at the economic research that are available for me, to me out there, we don't have good demonstration of that. I mean, you can go to the Catalyst website, and the Catalyst website will tell you that companies that are more diverse are performing better, but you have the typical chicken and egg problem. Are companies performing better because they're more diverse, or do they have the ability or the freedom or the luxury to be more diverse simply because they are performing better? And this is an area where I certainly would like to do more work on in the future. All right, so what I want to do in the rest of the talk is first kind of give you a sense of where the literature is in terms of trying to explain this glass ceiling. Really what's driving it. I'm going to summarize some work that is not mine and some work that I've contributed to. And then in the second part, but we'll see whether we get there or whether we keep that more for the Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about, in light of our understanding of the causes of these discrepancies, what is the role for public policy, is there a role for corporate policy, and what it should be. But again, if we run out of time, maybe I'll I'll leave those slides on the side, and we can keep that for the question and answers. All right, so let me start with this, which has been a super active research agenda for maybe close to 20 years now. And this work is really focused on the idea that there might be important differences between men and women in terms of a set of psychological attributes, and that these particular psychological attributes, because they map into educational choices, labor market choices, could be driving part of the gender gap and could be driving part of the glass ceiling. A lot of this work is being done in the lab. So, in economics, we also have lab. We take guinea pigs like undergrads, and then we get them to play games. So most of the work that I'm going to talk about here is being kind of lab-based. Let me just summarize a bit of this work. But the main theme that come out of this work are, number one, that it appears that women are more risk-averse than men. Number two, that it appears that women perform more poorly under competitive pressures than men. On top of that, they really dislike being put in a competitive environment, this work would claim. Extension of this work, I've also talked about women having a more difficult time, negotiating or asking for stuff. And then finally, there's lots of work talking about how women kind of lacking confidence, but there's also a flip side of this work that suggests that men are way overconfident. And I'm going to review this work, and I don't have the time to do this, but whenever I talk about this, I always want to stress this part, and I'll briefly return to it, is that we have all of this. What does it mean? Is it that we're born with those differences? Is that we are being nurtured by our parents or by our teachers to display those differential gender traits? I don't know. I have some sense. Maybe we can talk about it later. All right. So just a summary of this work in a few pictures. This is work that's actually survey work that's based on German data. This is basically survey data where people are being asked on, overall, how willing are you to take risk? Not at all or a lot, and this is mapping, kind of the gender gap in the fraction of men and women that would say that are not at all willing to take risk or very willing to take risk. And what you can see there is essentially that there's way more women over there saying that they are unwilling to take risk than they are women that are willing to take risk, right? So this is an illustration of this kind of gender gap in attitudes towards the general desire to take risk. Now you may ask yourself, why does this matter? Why would this matter for explaining the glass ceiling? The reason why it would matter would be because of relationship like this one. So what is that? It's again based on German data. It's the correlation that exists between the average earnings within an occupation and a measure of the variance of earnings within this occupation. And you can see that this is an upward sloping relationship. So occupations that pay more on average are also occupations where you should expect from one year to the next that there will be more uncertainty as to how much you're going to be earning, right? So if you think that someone dislikes taking risk, they will naturally select into occupations that fall lower on the y-axis, but they're doing that. They're also selecting into occupations that would pay less on average, right? So this is where the relationship becomes relevant. The work on gender and competition, I think, is best summarized by the two following slides. So slide number one, and again, I could spend a lot of time on this. This is really the first study on this. There's been lots of follow-up studies, but let me just focus on this one. So what is this? So it is one of these kind of lab experiments that is being run with undergrads. I believe this was done in Israel. What's the idea? So you take the undergrads, you put them in the lab, and you get them to play a little game. And this particular game is about solving mazes, okay? And then you do that under two different conditions. Under one condition, which is this one, you're paying the undergrad a piece rate for the number of mazes that they solve. So every time you solve a maze, you're getting $1. Okay? This is condition one. This is condition two, where it's the same undergrad populations. They are playing the same game, solving these mazes, but the compensation structure is different. It's now become more competitive. It's now turned into a tournament, where you are in the room, and whoever is going to solve the most mazes in the room is going to win the prize. And people that will not be the top in the room will just get paid much less or nothing. Okay? So what you get out of this is, if you look at this one, which is the piece rate settings, and you look at the distribution of how many mazes these students solve, and this is the the mazes that are solved by female in the dark, and in the white, the number of mazes that are being solved by men, you can see these distribution overlap pretty well with one another. Just 1 second. Now, if you look at this condition over here, where you've made the pay, in a sense, more competitive, you turn the game into some kind of a tournament settings, you can see that these two distributions start moving apart from one another, and on average, women are now solving fewer mazes than men. You had a question.
So it looks like even under the piece rate, the men are overrepresented at the top end. So I'm wondering whether this is an effect of specifically gender, or is this an effect of the good players are really motivated by tournaments, and it seems from figure 1 that the good players tend to.
Yeah, let me show you something else. I think it's going to go totally against this. So the main results over here is that it looks like women start performing worse when you put them into these more competitive settings. And I think a bit related to your point, this is a picture that would, kind of go with the point that women tend to really dislike this competition. So where would this be coming from? Get men and women to play this particular game, right, where they're being paid on the piece rate. They learn about themselves. They learn about how good they are, okay? And then ask them, after they've done that, whether they would like to play the game again, but under a tournament setting, right? So if you learn from stage 1 that you're actually really good at this game, well, you should select into the tournament structure rather than the piece rate structure, right? And this picture suggests that this is not happening. So what is this? Think about each of these groups as being groups organized, men and women, by how well they did on the piece rate in terms of how many mazes they solved. And some people really suck at it, and some people are pretty good at it, all right? So we can see among the guys is that there's this, roughly speaking, upward sloping relationship that you would expect, that the guys that did well, are self-selecting into, I want to do it now under the tournament structure. And for the woman, you don't see that. You see this much flatter slope. These women should be attracted by the piece rate settings, by the tournament settings, and they are not, okay? So this is the picture that will go with not only women, perform more poorly under competition, but they dislike these competitive environments, right? All right, so what I want to talk about a bit is, this work has been going on for decades. What has been happening much more recently has been attempts at taking this work outside the lab and trying to understand, okay, so does it matter? Can I really, explain why women are under-earning compared to men because of these differential psychological traits? And there's been a few papers, not many, some papers looking at educational choices, and a few papers looking at labor market earnings. I'm going to talk about only one of them. There's a paper that Luigi Zingales did with a few colleagues a couple of years back that uses the Booth MBA students as the guinea pigs. So what did Luigi do? He basically, took a prior cohort of Booth MBA students and got them to play the kind of games I described before, and was able to collect for all these students measures of risk aversion, but also for each student measures of how willing or unwilling they are to compete. Derived very much along using the methods that I described before. And then what he did is that he tried to see how much these measures of willingness to take risk related to one measure of labor market earnings for our students, which is what they earn when they leave the business school, okay? And then furthermore, if it matters, does it explain any of the gender gap in earnings between our male and female students, okay? So here's, maybe just 1 minute here. Why is it important to do this in the field, right? Remember, the lab work that I described before is done with the general population of undergrads. My core belief is that the kind of women that decide to go to business school are not a random draw from the undergrad population. And they're probably not a random draw in terms of the undergrad population, in terms of how willing they are to take risk and, and compete, right? So that kind of selection would make me believe that, these lab results over a broader population are probably overstating the importance of these effects. All right, so what did Luigi find? So number one, it is true that our female students earn somewhat less than our male students, even when they leave the business school. And I'm going to show you data later on that suggests that this gap grows way, way more. It's about a 10% difference at the time our students leave the business school. And you can see this in distribution terms. And it is also true that the students that prefer the piece rate environment to the tournament environment also earn less in their first job at the business school than the student that prefer the tournament environment. Yes?
When you compute these earnings, do you condition on full-time
I believe I've got some students in the room that 98% of people that leave the business school are going to be working full-time for a year. All right, so now the question is, if those things, both of these things are true, how much of this can be due to that? Because I would expect that there would be more women over here and fewer women over there, right? And this is what the regression kind of format looks at. So you can just focus on the first two columns. Number one is the simple kind of gender differences between our male and female students at the time they leave the school. It's about a 12% gap in earnings. And now, kind of what happens to this coefficient once you also control for the competitiveness of the student. And what you see is that, indeed, competitiveness, as we just saw in the paragraph, does matter. Students are more competitive, end up with higher earnings at the time they leave the business school. And it knocks down a little bit the coefficient on gender, which means that if I were to look at the data, there is probably a correlation between willingness to take risk and gender, but really by not that much. The coefficient is turned from 12% to 11%. All right, so the bottom line on this is that yes, competitiveness matter. Yes, women, even women that are business school, are slightly, kind of less desiring of entering a more competitive environment, but this doesn't feel like a first order factor in terms of explaining difference in earnings. And this is, my plan is not to go all of this, but the one study that I just talked about over here is one of now a growing set of studies that have attempted to do some kind of similar exercise. And none of these studies are perfect, and they all kind of try to do the same thing. I've got a labor data set. I've got some measures of psychological traits in this data set. I'm going to run, a wage regression, look at the gender dummy, and see what happens to gender dummy when I throw all of my psychological attributes into these regressions. And, a summary of, this literature would be, this is essentially by how much does the gender effect goes down if I account for psychological traits. And you can eyeball this column, but you are looking at something that is between 5 and maybe 15% at the upper limit. None of these studies, again, are perfect, but my reading of this work at this point in time is essentially, yes, we have great lab demonstration. We are starting to see some field-based work. I believe that this might be a factor. I believe that we have no work at this point in time that would certainly convince me that this is a first-order factor. It matters, but this is not the key explanation for what's going on in the labor market. All right. So now what I'm going to do is talk about the work that I've done kind of since more on, which is the kind of much more standard, traditional argument that big difference between men and women is that women remain for a set of reasons. We'll discuss this a bit later on. The dominant provider of everything that's happening outside of the workforce, i.e. the main provider of what's happening at home, and that's children and a lot of other stuff that happen at home. And the reason why this remaining asymmetry in terms of allocation of non-market tasks between men and women could be particularly relevant to explaining what's happening at the very top of the earnings distribution is that the kind of dedication to work you need to succeed at the upper part of the earnings distribution is going to be very difficult to combine with the flexibility you need because of your home responsibilities. The kind of occupations that pay the most in the economy are also occupations where you're expected to work long hours. You are going to be penalized heavily if you have to take a week, a month, a few months off the labor force. It will be difficult to re-enter the fast track. And because of this inflexibility of work in these occupations, the asymmetries that exist at the home are going to make it very difficult for women to achieve as well as men in the labor market. So let me try to talk about this with a few papers. So this is a study that I did now quite a long time ago, where we also studied the Booth MBAs. I think they were GSB MBAs at the time. And what we did, though, is survey them, not just get a sense of their earnings when they left the business school, but really try to get a sense of their earnings since they left the business school up to 13 years out. So we really surveyed multiple cohorts of students to try to get a sense of the trajectory. All right, so I think I can talk about these pictures looking at medians, but the means are, I think much more relevant if I'm worried about glass ceiling effects. And if you look at the means, you see essentially at the time you're leaving the business school, a gap that is very similar to the gap that Luigi found In the most recent cohort, it's about 10%, but this gap grows dramatically over time. So when you are 10 plus years out of the labor market, men are essentially earning close to 60% more than men. And to be very, very clear about this, this is not imputing zeros to our female students that have left the workforce. This men earning 60% more than women in a sample where I'm only including the men and women that are in the labor force, okay? All right, so the other part of our finding in this paper was that there was differences in labor supply between our male and female students. None of these differences were huge, but they certainly existed. So I can draw your attention to something like hours worked. At the time, male and female students leave the business school, they're all basically reporting working about a 60 hours a week, 10 years out or more. Men have only reduced their hours by about 3, the women are about 50 hours. Right? These are still, very hardworking people, but these differences exist. The other thing that is true is that a greater share of our female students compared to male students will have, at some point in time, been taking a break, right? And again, it's not like, female students leave the labor force for 5 years and then re-enter. It is essentially that by more than 10 years of having left school, our female students on average have taken 1 year out, and our male students have taken a tenth of a year out of the workforce, okay? And then what is remarkable about the data is that you can see that simply accounting for the facts that I just stressed, which is women work shorter weeks, and you do that flexibly, right? And the fact that women have had gaps in their labor market experience, are more likely to have taken some time out, have less accumulated experience than men, essentially explains most of these very large gender gaps that emerges 10 years out. Right? So the way you would see that is that at the very top of the panel is the raw differences in earnings. So it's the 9% that turns into close to 60% gap. You can see that there are slight differences in pre-MBA characteristics between our male and female students. There are some differences in grades. For students of mine in the class, grades matter. They make your earnings higher. But then the big transformation really happens over here. And what am I doing here? Am I doing some controls for whether or not you've taken some time out? And I'm controlling for how many hours a week do you work. And by simply adding these two components, which are a reflection of labor force participation and labor supply, what was a 60% gap in earnings has become a less than 10% gap in earnings. Now, this is still there, this is still big, and you can call this whatever you want. Right? You can call this discrimination, you can call this sexual harassment, you can call it whatever you want. The main point I want to stress is that you can do a lot and explain a lot simply by looking at this difference in labor supply. And now, linked to this is the work that Claudia Goldin has been doing kind of recently, which is trying to turn this example of the MBA students into a broader story. What exactly is going on, right? Well, this is the picture I showed you before. Remember, this is essentially showing that in all of the highest earnings occupations in the economy, women earn less than men, but really more saliently, that the higher earnings the occupation is, the bigger is the gender gap in compensation between men and women. Now, this is another picture that is looking at the same occupations. What is depicted over here? The same thing as before. This is a gender difference in earnings between men and women in these occupations. What's on the x-axis has changed. So what's on the x-axis is, let me take a moment and make sure that we all understand that. It's an attempt to proxy for how inflexible a particular occupation is, right? This is not perfect. Ultimately, I'd like to know, do I have to work on Sunday? How many days a week do I have to travel, right? Do you really want me to fax documents at 3 in the morning? Those kind of things. So we don't have data to capture all this. But one thing we can do easily across many occupations is look at something fairly simple, which is how elastic is earnings in one occupation to how many hours people work, right? So there might be occupations where, you're not going to get pay more if you work, 45 hours versus 40 hours. There's going to be occupations where if you are willing to go from 40 to 45, you're going to get very big increase in earnings, right? The bigger is the elasticity of income to hours worked, right? One could claim the more inflexible the occupation is. the more it's going to reward you if you are really willing to work those really, really long hours. And that's a good proxy for other features of work, okay? And what you can see here is that, again, you're going to be able to draw a line. Those occupations where the elasticity of income to our weekly hours is larger are exactly those occupations where women are under earning compared to men, okay? Now there's a few things that are, very, I think interesting about this picture is that the color code, which I have not stressed so far, also tells you that different sectors of the economy are, much more inflexible than others. So I think what's striking, maybe, kind of for me being in a business school, is the difference between the red square and the green triangle, right? So the tech sector does not have that much of this high elasticity of earnings to hours worked. The business sector has got much more of it, right? So if you, there was a question? Yeah. I don't know, and I wouldn't be able to actually tell you the exact occupation within the health sector that are over there. No, Claudia and Larry have a separate paper, Claudia and Larry have a separate paper where they look at one particular health occupations and describe it as the most gender equal occupation in the world, and that's pharmacist. So pharmacist might be over there, might be one of those dots. I believe that this must be pharmacy up there, where there's essentially no differences in earnings between men and women, and they really relate that to the structure of work in the pharmacies of today, which is, your CVS, where you have all of this kind of flexibility compared to the old days where more pharmacists were, kind of running their, kind of were self-employed, running their own shop. All right, so now why is inflexible work particularly difficult for women? My claim is that, related to what I said, is that women carry a broader share of the load when it comes to, the home. And in particular, I believe that most salient in the home is the role that children are playing. So let me just try to kind of show you a few pictures to convince you that this is indeed a first-order explanation. So this is back to the study we did with the Booth students in 2010. And I'm referring again now to these differences in labor supply, remember, between men and women, which hopefully have convinced you are a key drivers of why women are earning less than men. And what I'm doing now is, besides simply reminding you of the fact that, yes, women are more likely, forget this one, this is just having dropped out of the workforce, women are more likely to have, kind of taken some time out, so the actual experience is lower than that of men, and that women are working shorter weeks than men. I want to contrast now not two groups, men and women, but three groups. Men, women with child, and women without child, okay? I could also do men with child and men without child, but it wouldn't make a difference. They look the same. Now what you see here is that, again, you see that for the women without kids, indeed, for the women without kids, they are indeed slightly more likely to have taken some time out, but this coefficient is a sixth of the coefficient that we'd see for women with children. Similarly, if you look at how long our students work and how many hours they work per week, there's only a 3% difference between men and women that do not have children, but there's a 25% difference between men and women that have children, right? So this is the primary explanation for the differences in labor supply between our male and female students that map directly into explaining the very large gender gaps in earnings. This is work that you may have seen. I believe that The Economist ran a story not so long ago that is using just this fantastic data from Scandinavia, where they know everything about you. It's worse than Facebook. It's the government knows everything about you. That's even worse than Facebook. And what they did is essentially map the evolution of earnings of husbands and wife within a couple, and look at what happens to the evolution of earning of husbands and wife at the time of the birth of the first child within this couple. Okay? So I'm going to have two studies, one for Denmark, one for Sweden. This is not the population that we've talked about so far, by the way. So this is the entire population of those countries. And this is Scandinavia, right? So if you think about the place where the men are more likely to do the laundry, I would say that it is Scandinavia. So worth keeping in mind. So this is a picture for Sweden. So again, what's depicted over here, think about men and women within a couple. This is 10 years before the birth of their first child. This is the earnings trajectory. So this is a gap in earnings between husbands and wife up to the point where the first child is being born. This is what happened at the birth of the first child, and this never recovers. But if you believe that Sweden is special, let me show you Denmark. This is Denmark. It's essentially the same research design, except they've done a bit of manipulation so that the men and women's, the husbands and wives' earnings are essentially overlapping in the pre-data. So, but you see again, no differential gap in earnings between husbands and wife. But then the first child is born, the women take a big hit in earnings and they never recover. This maps into, like we predicted based on what we've seen before, there's big differences in hours worked between husbands and wives at the time of birth of the first child. Now, what they do in the Danish data, which I think is really nice, is an attempt to try, okay, so now that we understand this, now that we have estimated this child penalty, which is a very loaded word, I've realized. I was in Singapore over spring break, and they are dealing with, I think, a replacement ratio of 0.7 or something. And so you would start talking about child penalty, it's not a good idea. So I've learned, do not go to Singapore and talk about child penalty. But we're not in Singapore. So what I try to do here is essentially, let me go back over time. I've estimated, kind of this child penalty, I have a sense of how large they are. How much can they explain of the difference in earnings overall between men and women in Denmark? And what they basically say is, if you go back in 1980, well, this is the gender gap in 1980. And yeah, what happens at the time of birth of the child is important, but there's also stuff that's related to education, and there's also stuff that I just cannot explain, all right? But then go back over time, obviously overall, the gender gap in earnings has gone down in Denmark. And when you come to essentially today, you can see that the only thing that's left, right, is driven by, this child penalty. This essentially, according to their, and there's some assumption that goes into doing this exercise as always, but obviously education stuff has become very relevant because they have the same kind of reversals as the one I've discussed at the very beginning. And, kind of they can explain all of that's left with the child penalty, so hence there's essentially no residual left. All right, so I don't know what I'm doing for time, I can't see. Okay, so I should probably, I'm not going to do the policy stuff, but I want to say a few more things. So should this be puzzling to you, right? So if my claim is that, the main story, the first order story you should have at the top of your mind in terms of what's going on is really just the old stuff about work-family balance. Should it be surprising, given that the world has changed? The life that we have is not the life that our moms used to have. In particular, and we don't do, as much, we don't need as much time to take care of the home as we used to in the past. And gender roles have changed, right? The guys of today's and the women of today's have different views as to, how balanced things should be within a couple. So just a few things in this regard. So first one, on this amount of non-market work, there's no doubt, and Eric is at the back of the room, and he's been, kind of doing a lot of, great work on time use. There's no doubt that the amount of time that is being spent on home-related activities and chores has been going down, right? For both men and women. The one trend, though, that I think is deserving way more attention is what's been going on with the amount of time we're spending on our children. That is being going up, and dramatically more so for the more educated among us, right? So more educated parents are spending way more time on their kids than, the prior generation. There's not lots of work, but there's some work that's been discussing that, where it's coming from, whether it's worthwhile or not, whether it's part of the rat race where we all want our kids to go to Harvard. I don't know the explanation, but it's, I think, an important trend that, especially when you think about it, these families can afford the nanny. It's not the fact that they cannot afford to hire someone to take care of the child, but if your goal is to make sure that your kids are going to be going to Harvard, I don't think you're going to outsource that to a nanny. All right, then, on these issues of gender role and gender identity, and this is kind of where I've done more work, there is, again, no doubt that if you survey people and look at their views as to whether women belong in the labor market or in the home, you see much less, much less of a negative reaction by both men and women to the idea that women should be in the labor market. But some norms have been slower to converge towards what I would call a gender-neutral environment, in particular norms related to whether or not a child can do well with a working mom. That has been converging, but there's still, I believe, I think a quarter of college-educated men and women that believe that a child is going to suffer if a mom is working. Furthermore, I believe that the kind of norm we typically look at is masking a sort of other norms that might be more dormant, that are more likely to manifest themselves in an environment where women become more competitive in the workplace. So I've done some work on a norm that is more relevant today than it was when women were earning a quarter of what men were earning, which is guys don't like their wives to over-earn them, and maybe they'll be more likely to push them towards the home if this is likely to happen. And then finally, linking back to the small thing that I said about nature versus nurture, I think we should view things that women should not compete, women should not take too much risk, women should not be too ambitious, as also being, in part, something that is inculcated, I don't know the word, that we teach our kids. So on this, some work that's been done by Leo Bernstein in this building that suggests that even if you take today's young men and women in an MBA program, a top MBA program in the country, this is not Booth, it's another one, at least those female students believe that they should not be too ambitious. And so let me tell you what the study that they did, I think I'll conclude with that. So this was based on a questionnaire that was run with all the MBA students in their first year on preferences that they had for various kind of jobs. And this was a high-stake environment in that the answers to this questionnaire were going to be used in terms of placement for internships. So it was high-stake. And then they did the following manipulation, is that they told a random half of the students that were filling those questionnaires that their answers would be kept anonymous. And then the other half was told that the answers would be discussed with other students later on, right? So no anonymity versus anonymity. And then what they did is compare the answers for single versus non-single students, men and women, right? So what's the idea? If you could view it two ways, right? So if the women understand that the men don't want the woman to be ambitious, and the women are hopeful, single women are hopeful that maybe their husband is going to be somewhere in the room, they, may not want to look too ambitious. Or you could view it, and that's another, part of, kind of Leo's work, that maybe the women wrongly believe that the guys would really penalize them in the dating market if they look like they are greedy and want to have a career. Whichever way you want to look at it, these are the results. So this is, answer the question, how much do you want to earn? Okay, what is your desired competition in life? And remember, single versus non-single. These people are not looking to marry. And this is women versus men. Right, so you can view all of these as kind of like control conditions. The group that is really the interesting one is this one. Single women that are put into the private conditions. I'm going to answer the survey. No one is ever going to see my response. This is all going to get aggregated. Are reporting that they want more compensation than the single women that are being told that their answers will be discussed with the other students, including the guy that they want to date. This is how willing are you to travel? How many days a month are you willing to travel? Again, this is like the treatment condition. Single women in the private conditions are saying they're willing to travel a lot. Single women in the public conditions are much less willing to respond that they're going to be willing to travel a lot. This is another one, or how ambitious you are. Again, you got the same results. Okay, so I think this is just one example of like many I could have provided, that assuming that we live today in a world where norms have become irrelevant and we have fully balanced things is certainly not right. So, and then the final thing, and I'm certainly not going to do the policy part because I'm out of time. The other thing that you could find puzzling about this is, right, so I've hopefully convinced you that you can't ignore the fact that there's still a bit of a double shift, especially if you think about children. You can't assume that norms have totally become gender neutral, even though we've made some progress. Are there other forces? And in the paper that I believe was kind of linked to for the talk, there are two sets of results that I talk about, which I think are worth considering. This is kind of suggestive evidence that even though the changes in the home, like the dishwashers and all these things, have somewhat reduced the double shift, have made women essentially a bit more flexible with their time than they used to be in the past. Maybe in the workforce, things have moved in another direction. So the way we try to suggest this in the paper is that, you remember the correlation between earnings and hours worked? That was my measure of flexibility. What we document is that, in particular in the higher earnings occupations in the economy, if you look at 40 years of data, this correlation has been going up. So at the same time as women are becoming a bit more free and have more flexibility to provide in the workforce, it's as if the workforce is asking even more inflexibility than it did in the past. So it's kind of this countervailing force. And the very final point I mentioned is that it is also true, if you look at the data, that in the past, those women that were in those high earnings occupations, they were much less likely to be married and much less likely to have kids. So for many of these women, the considerations that I've been stressing were not relevant. And many more of the women today that are in these high earnings, occupations are married, have children, and they're not married to random people. They are married to men that also are in high earnings occupations who are, facing very inflexible jobs and growingly inflexible demand on their time, okay? So I'm going to stop with that. That, means, but maybe I'll just show the very last slide and skip through all the policy stuff. So I just want to say this. So I've not talked about discrimination and I've not talked about sexism. Again, you should be living on a rock not to believe that these factors are not relevant. They obviously are relevant, and I'm not one arguing that they are not relevant. I've been thinking a lot about this. But what I want to strongly argue is that we can explain a lot of what's going on in the labor market, in the glass ceiling, without having to resort to this as being the sole explanation. The first order explanation is not there. But that doesn't mean that, this is not a real story for a lot of people. I would also say the trends are indeed moving in the right direction. Then maybe ultimately the market will fix themselves, firms will adjust, we design work in a way that makes it easier for essentially accommodating the growing talent that they are receiving that is overwhelmingly becoming female rather than male. So the market ultimately, may fix all of this. I don't know how long it would take. And then the final thing I would say in the spirit of, I can't read the future, it's kind of interesting to think about the next wave of technology and AI and what it would mean for, the structure of work. Will it make it more flexible, less flexible? I have no idea, but it's fun to think about. So I'm going to stop there.